Welcome to the June 23rd update of the IHME COVID-19 forecasting model, where we provide some analysis. My name is Alan Featherstone. This work is done with Jonathan Featherstone and Julia Maddock. And if you want the slides, they're available on www.agmanager.info. The outline for this discussion is that since June 16th there hasn't been any revisions to the model. Therefore, we'll maybe go through this a little bit quicker this week, given that there hasn't been any revisions to the model that have been released. We're going to look at the Kansas and U.S. mortality statistics. Then we're going to continue to look at where we have actually been on deaths compared to the March 26 model forecast. And then we're going to look at the cumulative deaths compared to that original March 26 model. The virus certainly is having a major effect on the economy, with an employment rate most recently released of 13%. Since the middle of March, roughly 3 months ago, there's been 45 million U.S. workers file for unemployment. The Institute for Health Metrics and Evaluation plays a large role in the formation of policy. You have the website there if you want to take a look at their model more in depth. One of the things that we're doing here is just trying to help understand how accurately the model forecasts, and this is an update of the June 16th model. The last major modeling change occurred on May 29th. The other thing I think that's important to realize is the paper still is in the peer review process. Looking at an update from last week with regards to the distribution of COVID deaths, one of the things, if you compare that with the 2018 mortality rates for Kansas, you can see that in the 85 plus, in the 65 to 74, in the 55 to 64, and even in the 45-54, the death rate is a little higher than the distribution of mortality rates in Kansas. There is the situation, and again, it's probably just due to small numbers, where from 75 to 84, the mortality rate is a little bit less than the Kansas population as a whole. In Kansas, there's been 259 deaths over the last week. That's been an increase of about 15 deaths over the last week. For the U.S. as a whole, in terms of taking a look at this, again, you can see for the U.S. as a whole, essentially 65 and above have a higher mortality rate, and then pretty much 64 and below have a lower mortality rate for COVID. This information was taken from the CDC. Regarding the CDC, they have reported 103,000 deaths since the beginning. We can then look at these in terms of deaths per thousand. Again, with 3 months gone, in terms of if you wanted to get a look at the number of deaths per thousand in Kansas, you probably could multiply these numbers by 4. Doing that for 85 plus, roughly 6 deaths would be attributed to COVID, and on an annual basis in 2018, roughly there was 142 deaths at 85 plus. And so again, you can see that while every death is important, and every death is a story, it is important to realize that the deaths per thousand of COVID make up a small portion of the deaths in Kansas overall. You can also see this with regards to the U.S. Again, if you would multiply this by 4, essentially you would be in the 22 deaths per thousand due to COVID. And so you can see the U.S., all of these numbers are a little bit higher than what has been observed in Kansas. We're going to take a look at the U.S. and then the 50 states with regards to the probability distribution for death. This is the daily distribution. The big thing we're looking at here is with the relaxing of some of the states nationwide, do we see an uptick in deaths? Certainly, it's been in the news that there has been uptick in cases, and while that certainly is important, ultimately we're trying to prevent deaths with the policies that that have been implemented. And so one of the things you can end up seeing, and you do see a weekly pattern with regards to those, but certainly there continues to be a downtrend in the U.S. in the number of deaths. In terms of the last couple days, it's dropped below 500 deaths on a daily basis. In terms of Kansas, one of the things you see here is there was a tick up in terms of the last two reporting periods where 5 and 7 deaths were reported. Those were the highest rates since 4, kind of in the first couple weeks of June. Again, you see the up and down simply because of data reporting. And a lot of times you're seeing that states are reporting these on an every other day basis, or maybe a Monday, Wednesday, Friday basis, and so you're going to see a little bit of choppiness in these numbers. In terms of Colorado, we'll take a look at states around Kansas. Again, they've been floating over the last week of less than 20 deaths, a downward trend. You look at Nebraska, in terms of they had a high number about a week ago where they had 12 individuals, and then that has dropped off a little bit. In terms of Missouri, a high reported number last week, and then the last few days the deaths have been averaging maybe 5 per day. Oklahoma is in a good situation, very flat, very limited death on a daily basis. Now we're moving into the New York area. One of the things that you see over the last week, it's continued the downward trend in death. Same for New Jersey, same for Connecticut. In terms of Massachusetts, other than a little bit of a spike there, has continued to see a downward trend in death. Maryland, a little bit of a spike there again, and that could be due to reporting numbers, but again, over the last couple weeks there's a downward trend. In some respects, Delaware has been floating between 0 and 5 deaths since about the 12th of June. In terms of, you also see some downward trend with regards to Rhode Island. In the last week, most days have been less than 10 per day. New Hampshire has been fluctuating in this less than 6 amount. Vermont is in a good situation in terms of very limited death. Really only 3 deaths since about the 10th of May. Maine has had a very good situation the whole way along. In terms of very flat curve with not much death. Pennsylvania continues the downward trend over the last week, and so you can see a downward trend. Ohio continues a downward trend, and so it does appear Michigan maybe has leveled off, but again they're starting to level off very close to 0. Indiana in some respects is on a slight downward trend over the last week. Illinois seems to be on a downward trend, certainly some choppiness there. Iowa has been very steep here over the last couple of weeks. You'll see Minnesota, it appears that over the last couple of weeks they may be trending downwards. Wisconsin has kind of been level in some respects since about the 26th of May in terms of kind of floating between 0 and 20 deaths per day. In terms of Florida, Florida is one of the states that has opened up. Again, while cases may have maybe spiking. There is a fairly level situation with regards to death, and perhaps even a downward trend since the 1st of June. In terms of Georgia, looking at Georgia, certainly ups and downs. There seems to be some cyclical nature to that, but overall, at least a level trend. Certainly not an increasing trend since they've relaxed some of the social distancing rules. South Carolina seems to be fairly level, kind of bouncing around in the 5 to 20 range over the last week. In terms of North Carolina, again, level, perhaps a little bit of a downward trend here. It'll be interesting to see how that looks next week. Virginia, somewhat of a downtrend. And so one of the things you end up seeing is if we look in the southeast compared to the northeast, the southeast has just had a much better situation than what occurred in the northeast. In Kentucky, certainly somewhat of a downward trend. Tennessee seems to be fairly level over the last few weeks. Alabama, also level, kind of bouncing around between 0 and 20 in the last week. Mississippi, and again, this could be a data reporting where they didn't report over the weekend, and then they reported roughly 41 deaths on the Monday, and so it'll be interesting to see if this is more of just a reporting artifact than actual situation. Louisiana continues a downward trend in terms of essentially since the 6th of June. Most days it's been between 0 and 20. Arkansas had an uptick there, but again, over the last week, when you average 0 and the 15, it's more in that 0 to 10.10 death range that has been occurring. Texas has kind of been bouncing essentially since about the middle of May, between 0 and 50 deaths on a daily basis, and it's kind of remained under 50 on a daily basis for quite a while. New Mexico, the last week has been between or less than 10 deaths. In terms of Arizona, and in terms of essentially here, if you go all the way back to the middle of 10, it looks like a fairly similar distribution since May 10. Utah, kind of floating normally between 0 and 5 deaths, but there were a couple spikes on the 19th of May and essentially the 12th or 13th of June. Wyoming has had pretty good experience in terms of very little death, usually less than 2, all the way back until the end of April. Montana, even a better situation than Wyoming, where essentially you can go back to the end of April, and the most they've had on any day has been 1 death. North Dakota, certainly a few peaks here, a peak here with four deaths, but again, a relatively good situation. South Dakota, same type of thing. Idaho, kind of floating between essentially 2 deaths since the end of May forward. A lot of days with 1. Nevada, in terms of, it does look like there is some downward trend beginning to occur here. Again, floating between 0 and 10 deaths a day since the 1st of June. California, again, a little bit level, perhaps a bit of a downward trend in terms of they have had some days now where there were less than 50 deaths per day. Oregon, in terms of floating a lot of days with regards to almost in this 0 to 6 range all the way since the 1st of May. Washington, generally on a downward slope. Again, this could be reporting difference where they had 0 deaths, and then they reported 2 days in one aspect. Alaska just hasn't been a big issue in terms of all the way back to the first part of April, just the death here and then. And Hawaii has not had a death attributed to COVID since May 4th. Those are the daily projections. I think it's good to begin to take a look at where we are with regards to the original model and then what we've experienced since. And again, the green lines here are the plus and minus 2 standard deviation confidence interval, roughly. The purple line is the mean expectation, and the red line is what the actual cumulative death total has been. In terms of, if you look at the numbers from the COVID tracking project, where I've downloaded these numbers, we're less than 120,000 deaths. At this point, the original model predicted we would be at about 80,000, and so in some respects, we're about 30,000 more than what occurred. Kansas, in terms of the original projection, was in that 600 range. We actually, in Kansas, have experienced the 250 deaths roughly, and that is below the 5% confidence interval. And so the original model certainly over-predicted by a fairly large margin those deaths. And that's one of the things I think is important to begin to think about, is those that were under or outside the confidence bound, either below or above, and then those that are within the confidence interval but above or below the mean. Colorado, below the 95% confidence interval. Nebraska, below the mean but within the 95% confidence interval. Missouri, below the mean but within the 95% confidence interval. Oklahoma, below the 95% confidence interval. And so Oklahoma, and if you look at all the states kind of in this Great Plains area around Kansas, in general, all the states are below the mean expectations, and several of them are outside the 95% confidence interval. We move into the Northeast. One of the things you'll see is New York is above the 95% confidence interval. They're roughly about 2,500 more deaths than what was expected. New Jersey, significantly above the confidence interval. Connecticut, and this is one of the things you'll see in the Northeast. Massachusetts, Maryland is just kind of beginning to break out for this period of time. They were kind of within the confidence interval, but over the last week, the amount of death has pulled them above what that original confidence interval was expected. Conversely, in the Northeast, there's a couple states that are doing fairly well. Delaware is below that confidence interval, and they've remained there the entire period. Rhode Island is above. Essentially, the expectation was about 300 deaths by this point in time, and the experience has been about 900 deaths. New Hampshire is a little bit below the mean, but within the confidence interval. Vermont is within the confidence interval and below the mean, and then Maine has just been below the confidence interval the entire time. As we begin to move into the Midwest, Pennsylvania is above the confidence interval. Ohio is above the original confidence interval. Michigan is above the original confidence interval. Indiana is above the original confidence interval. Illinois is also. Iowa is above the confidence interval. In terms of the expectation, there was roughly about 150, and Iowa is up to about 700. Minnesota is below the mean, but within that confidence interval, and so relatively their experience has been better than what was originally projected. Same with Wisconsin in terms of they're within the confidence interval, but they are below the mean. Now we move into the Southeast in terms of Florida. Again, they are much below what was predicted, but they are within that 95% confidence interval. Same with Georgia in terms of it's below what the original projection was, but they're within the confidence interval. South Carolina is below the confidence interval. North Carolina is below the mean within the confidence interval. Virginia is below the mean within the confidence interval. West Virginia is below the confidence interval, and so their experiences have been much less than what was expected. Kentucky, below the mean within the confidence interval. Same with Tennessee. Same with Alabama. Mississippi is in the same situation. Louisiana is within the confidence interval, but above the mean. Arkansas is below the confidence interval, and so Arkansas has had an experience quite a bit better than what was projected. Texas, again, the projection was about 4,000 at this point in time. They've experienced about 2,000 deaths due to COVID, and so again, they're below the mean, but within the confidence interval. Same for New Mexico, same for Arizona. Utah is outside the confidence interval, so they've had a better experience than projected. Wyoming, Montana, North Dakota is within the confidence interval, but below the mean. Same for South Dakota. And so kind of in those mountain region states and the upper Great Plains, again, a relatively good experience from what was projected. Idaho is actually above the mean, but within the confidence interval. Nevada is below the mean within the confidence interval. California above the mean within the confidence interval. Oregon below the mean within the confidence interval. Same for Washington. Then we finish up with Alaska, again below the confidence interval, much better experience than expected, and then the same for Hawaii. And so certainly the 49th and 50th state have done well from a COVID perspective. To summarize, again, the IHME model continues to be revised, although it wasn't this week. And again, it tends to drive policy decisions that have resulted in large negative economic effects for the agricultural economy. One of the things I think that's important to realize is the death rate from COVID is low, and it's not substantially different from a distribution perspective from the death from all causes. Certainly it does affect those, as all disease does, those that are older. But again, the percentage of the deaths, at least in Kansas and the U.S., tend to be very much the same. In terms of from a distributional perspective, the U.S. cumulative death total through June 22nd is above the mean, but within the 95% confidence band from the original model. And then kind of comparing these from the original with regards to a state-by-state basis, you have the different regions here. There's 12 states where they're above the mean and above the 95% confidence level. And so essentially when the model was projected, there would only be a 2.5% chance that these states would have been outside that band. And it's Connecticut, Illinois, Indiana, Iowa, Maryland, Massachusetts, Michigan, New Jersey, New York, Ohio, Pennsylvania, and Rhode Island. Certainly upper Midwestern states and the Northeast had an experience that was much worse than predicted. 3 states above the mean but within the 95% confidence interval: California, Idaho, Louisiana. And then you have 20 states below the mean but within the 95% confidence interval. A lot of southeastern states, both the Dakotas are there, Texas, Washington, Wisconsin, in terms of just a broad number of states. Roughly 20 states are below the mean but within that 95% confidence interval. And then there's 15 states that are outside to the good on this confidence interval in terms of there was a 2.5% chance that they would be below that lower bound. And those states are Alabama, Alaska, Arkansas, Colorado, Delaware, Hawaii, Kansas, Maine, Montana, Oklahoma, South Carolina, Tennessee, Utah, West Virginia, and Wyoming. Hopefully this gives you an update in terms of what's going on with the COVID situation. Again, we will take a look at this next week, and so thanks for your attention.